And he read the script and said, I'm not going to do this. And so he wrote his own, and he comes in, and Sheldon Leonard says, I love your idea, but I like mine better. He says, you're not a track man. You're a tennis player. And you're not out there alone. You got a partner, and he's black. And Bob Culp said, you know what? I like your idea better too. But it came from Bob Culp's script. Sheldon Leonard read it. He was trying to put together a show for Bill Cosby, who was brand new, but he was doing comedy shows, and he was the hot new comedian. Him and Woody Allen were like coming up really strong together. And Sheldon Leonard had saw Bill Cosby at the Hungry Eye up in San Francisco, and he said, this guy is an actor. This guy can act. And he's an athlete. And he was a former football player at Temple University. And so Sheldon was trying to develop a series for him. Nobody had ever done a series with a black character that was like that on network TV. There had been Amos and Andy, and there had been Beulah, who was a black maid working in white people's home. And there was Rochester on the Jack Benny show, and there were guest parts. But nobody had really done a show with a black lead. And so Sheldon was trying to sell that, and it was going to be a detective show with Bill Cosby. And the networks were leery of it, so he thought, well, what if he's a white partner? And what if the lead partner of the detective agency? So that was the idea Sheldon Leonard had. And then Bob Culp's script landed on his desk, courtesy of Carl Reiner, and he read it, and he went, spies traveling the world. And so he got that from Bob Culp. So that's why there was no created by credit on the show, because it really came from two different people, and it was a merging of their idea, and Sheldon didn't want to share the created by credit with Robert Culp. Gave him a piece of the action on the show, but that's how that came together.
Oh, yeah. And they were one of the first TV shows ever to travel the whole world, weren't they?
The first, yeah. Route 66 came on a couple of years before I Spy, and that traveled across America a few times. But they would do it the old-fashioned way. They would take a whole convoy of trucks with them, with the big arc lights and the way everything was always filmed, and it was a giant undertaking. Nobody had shot around the world on a TV show. You had Secret Agent with Patrick McGowan, another great show, but it had come on 1 year earlier. But it was shot in London, and they would just use the back lot, and occasionally they would go do a little second unit somewhere. So this was the first show to do it, and the thing that made it possible was a guy named Fouad Said, S-A-I-D. And he was a young Egyptian filmmaker, and he came to Sheldon Leonard when he saw in the trade papers they were going to do this show. And Sheldon had gone over and done a test episode in Hong Kong, and everything had gone wrong. And then Fouad came into his office, and he was like in his mid-20s, and he said, I can make this happen for you. And he showed him he had wireless microphones that he had perfected. He had the Aeroflex camera, which he brought over from Europe, which was a small, compact film camera that Hollywood wasn't using. He had designed quartz light kits, which were small, compact, and easily assembled and taken down, unlike giant arc lights. And he had built this mobile studio called the Cinemobile that when they did the show, they would put it into a flying tiger and fly it to whatever country they were shooting in. So this thing had a platform on top of it that could hydraulically raise in about 30 seconds. And with the wireless microphones, the quartz lights, the Aeroflex camera, they could go shoot anywhere on the run. And if you watch some of those episodes they did in Hong Kong, they got hundreds of extras around them. These aren't extras. These are just real people mulling on the streets. And you see Culp and Cosby sitting there doing dialogue right next to the bay, and there's all these people passing in front of them and around them on the streets. And I used to see that as a kid and think, how did they organize all this on a TV show budget? Well, the way they did it is they had the Cinemobile, and they would throw the doors open, and the cameras were in there, and Cosby and Culp were wired up with the wireless mics, and they would get a take really quick. That's my dog wants to get into the radio show. They would do a take really fast, and then they would close everything up, and they would take off before the crowds assembled. And one last thing, if I'm not telling you too much here, they did a thing called the sweat box, where they would put a box on a corner, and the cameraman would be inside of it, and there'd be a little hole for the camera lens to point through, and they'd be filming through that. And the reason they called it a sweat box is because after about 20 minutes in that thing, they would call out to the cameraman and no response, and the reason why, in Hong Kong with the humidity, the guy had passed out inside this box trying to film.
Oh, wow.
So they were inventing it all. Culp and Cosby both told me their dressing room was the alleyways. They would go in an alleyway and change their clothes and come out. They didn't have dressing rooms. They had nothing. And they're out there filming in Hong Kong, in Japan, in Italy, in Spain, all in Mexico, all over the place, and just on the run, shooting on the run, doing a network TV show from 1965 through 68. It was amazing.
Oh, yeah, it was, Mark. And you know what I liked about it? You know, like in Hong Kong or in Greece or wherever they were at, you know, the way they did it, it made you feel like you were there. Unlike when you go watch, I hate to say it, The Avengers or any of those other spy shows, okay? It was all canned in the studio. You can tell it, you know.
Studio and backlot. Yeah. I mean, Mission Impossible was all right there at the Desilu Studios. They had 2 sound stages, and they would go use the same streets that were used in the Untouchables and everything.
And Hogan Heroes.
Fake European accents. And I Spy actually was taking us to Greece and the Greek islands and all this stuff. But after 3 years, Sheldon said, let's stop. They just didn't want to do it anymore. They had been renewed for a 4th year. As a matter of fact, NBC wanted them for 2 more years, guaranteed 4th and 5th season pickups. And Sheldon pulled the plug. Bill and Bob had both gotten all their shots. They were getting ready to take off for Bangkok in a couple of weeks to start the 4th year of filming. They had all the scripts written, and suddenly Sheldon calls up and says, we're off. And it's just that he was exhausted from everything that was going on in that show. I mean, when they went to Japan, I mean, the Japanese mafia was beating up their production managers and taking people hostage and everything else.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know that.
Yeah. When they went to Greece, they were flying into Greece to shoot 6 or 7 episodes. They do like a block of like 6 or 7 episodes in each country. And they're flying in, and they've already arranged all the locations. They've arranged everything. And as they're flying in, there was a military coup. And it was in 1967. A bunch of generals took over the country. And they were denied permission to land. And so they've got Culp and Cosby in there, and I think they had a couple other celebrities who were going to be guest stars in some episodes and were coming over to shoot their bits. And they weren't allowed to land. And Sheldon Leonard was on the plane. He was a real gambler, and he says, they're not going to let us perish. Just keep circling. They're going to let us land. And they ended up with nothing but fumes in their gas tank, and they barely made it to Portugal to make an emergency landing. And then they had to send their production manager, Leo Chuknik, I think his name was, with a suitcase full of cash into Greece to bribe the generals to let them come back in and film these episodes that had been planned. And you know, the guns that they used were real guns with blanks in them. And so at the end of shooting, every day they had to turn in all their weapons. Kelly and Scott had to turn over their guns. The military was there behind the cameras for everything they filmed. And they would have to turn in their weapons at the end of the day, and they wouldn't get them back to the next day because you could take the blanks out and put real bullets in those guns. When they were in North Africa, Casablanca, and shooting around there, they got lost for days. They were missing. It was in all the Hollywood trades. Bill Cosby, Robert Culp, missing somewhere in North Africa, out in the desert.
Oh, wow. I didn't
even
know that.
Trucks were out there, and they got lost, and they got into a dust storm, and they could have perished out there. So this is what was going on as they were filming this show. It's all in the book. And the reason I wrote this book is because I would watch this show, and I would wonder, how did they do this? In the late 60s, mid to late 60s, on a TV show budget, how did they do this show? And also, how did they get a white and a black actor sharing the same hotel room in 1965 and have it be carried by NBC affiliates in the Deep South? And I thought, how did they pull this off? And I met Robert Culp, and I asked him, and he started telling me. all these things. And I said, this should be a book. Why isn't there a book? And he said, we don't know. Me and Bill talk about it all the time. We don't understand why nobody's ever written a book about this, because there was never a TV show like this. Nobody ever went through it. We went through, invented the technology that we invented, portrayed the type of stories that we were doing, created the buddy genre, created it. And the white-black casting, the first black actor to win an Emmy, and he won 3 in a row, Bill Cosby, as best lead actor in a drama. It really kicked the doors open. And so I said, well, I'll write it. Because I wanted to know the story. There wasn't a book for me to buy. So I did all the research. I went through the show files. I interviewed everybody, and Bob Culp was just wonderful. He had me over so many different times and would talk to me on the phone and just help me along to make sure it was right and everything in there was what they went through.
Oh, yeah. Which wife number was he at when you were interviewing him?
Was it 3 or 4? It was his last wife. He was alone when he died. They had just separated. What was her name? Was it Candace? I think. Yeah, I think it was Candace.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. And I met her. Nice woman, but they'd been together for probably 10 years or so, and I think the magic had kind of left the relationship. So they separated right after I finished the book, and he died not too long after that. He was going to make a movie on a script he had been trying to sell for many years based on Terry and the Pirates. And he had just found out they had the financing and they were in pre-production. They were going to go to Indonesia to film it. And he was out taking a walk, and he died. And they didn't know at first whether he had had a heart attack and fallen and hit his head, or whether he had fallen and hit his head and then had the heart attack. They didn't know which the sequence was, but it was the combination of a heart attack and a blow to the head. They killed him.
Yeah, that was such a loss, too. I mean, really.
Terrible loss. Because he was about ready to go off and do this dream project that he'd been wanting to do for so many years as writer and director of this Terry and the Pirates movie, which was a comic strip he loved as a kid.
You know, it was interesting, too. You know, when me and him would chat, he was so excited about this movie. And I know he went to Hong Kong to scout out, I think it was Hong Kong. Maybe I'm wrong there. But he went out, you know, I think a month or two before he passed, you know, scouting out the streets and all that stuff. And
his daughter was out there teaching English as a second language. He was so proud of her. And he called me up one day and he said, can you find a picture of me and Bill in those, you know, I can't think of the word of what they were called, but you know, when the runner would pull you on that little cart that you're sitting in Hong Kong, and they were in those in a couple of the episodes. And Rimshaw, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said, you know, I know there were publicity pictures of us, and so I had one, and so I sent it over to him, and he framed it and sent it to his daughter because she was in Hong Kong teaching. But he went over and scouted locations, and he was an artist too. He did storyboards. He gave me the script, and an I Spy reunion movie script that he had written as well, and there's drawings in there of these locations that he would go and check out, and he would do these storyboards and put them in there.
Oh, wow.
I've still got it. I've got that script. I'm going to have to give it to somebody sometime because it's been in the basement forever in a box, and I feel guilty.
Well, you know, it was a shame that he couldn't have done his life, you know, long dream of that movie. You know, like I said, when the last time we were chatting, he was so proud of this movie that he was going to get the financing and everything was a go. And then, you know, boom, you know, but I guess that happens to all of us, doesn't it, at a certain point?
Oh, well, we all have ups and downs, and we all have disappointments. And, you know, I look at his life as a great success. You know, I mean, he created an iconic character. He co-created an iconic series. It did so much for race relations and civil rights in the 60s, you know, that he was so proud of that. Because when Sheldon wanted to put Bill into this show, everybody wanted Bob Culp. They had all been trying to get him to agree to do another series. He'd done Track Down, and every pilot was being offered to him. And ironically, him, William Shatner, and Jack Lord were the three guys that almost every pilot was being offered to. Jack Lord was even